It begins with a simple question. How can we move without a horse? For centuries, the horse was the only way to travel fast. But horses have limits. They get tired. They get sick. They need food and rest. Inventors looked for a new source of power. They looked to magnets and felt the invisible pull. They wondered if this invisible force could drive a carriage. The first attempts were clumsy. In the 1830s, men in Scotland and America built small models. They used batteries that could not be recharged. Once the power ran out, the machines stopped. It was a dead weight. These were not practical cars. They were science experiments. But they proved a point. Electricity could create motion. It was a start. In 1834, a man named Thomas Davenport lived in Vermont. He was a blacksmith. He worked with iron and steel. He read about magnets and electricity. He wanted to build a motor. He built a small device that ran on electricity. It was the first direct current electric motor made in America. Davenport was excited. He mounted his motor on a small model car. It ran around a circular track. It was a tiny thing, but it moved on its own. Davenport did not stop there. He dreamed big. He wanted to build a full-sized locomotive. He tried to patent his idea. He tried to find investors, but the technology was not ready. The batteries were too weak. They held very little charge. His motor worked, but it could not run for long. People called it a toy. Davenport spent all his money on his dream. He died poor, but his spark did not fade. It waited for better batteries. For 30 years, the technology sat on a shelf. Then a breakthrough happened in France. In 1859, a physicist named Gaston Plante invented the lead-acid battery. This was a turning point. It was a storage battery. It could hold electricity. It could release that electricity slowly. But Plante's battery was still weak. It took a long time to charge. It was heavy. Another inventor named Camille Faure changed this in 1881. He improved Plante's design. He made the battery stronger and more efficient. Now there was a power source that could actually move a heavy vehicle. The electric car was possible again. This was the moment the dream returned. At the same time, a problem grew in American cities. The problem was horses. In 1890, there were no cars in New York City. There were almost no bicycles. There were only horses and carriages. A city with 1 million people needed about 100,000 horses. These horses created a massive amount of waste. Each horse produced 20 pounds of manure every day. The streets were covered in filth. Flies spread disease. The city smelled terrible. When it rained, the streets turned to mud mixed with waste. When the sun shone, the dust blew into people's faces and houses. The people of the cities were desperate for a solution. They wanted a clean way to travel. They looked at the electric motor. They looked at the storage battery. They saw an answer. The electric car promised a clean, quiet street. It promised to remove the manure and the noise. It was a noble idea. In the late 1880s, inventors in Europe and America began to build electric cars again. In London, a man named Magnus Volk built an electric tricycle. In Paris, inventors raced electric cars. But the story takes a strong hold in the United States in 1890. This is where the American electric car was truly born. William Morrison lived in Des Moines, Iowa. He was a chemist, not a carriage maker. He understood batteries and electricity. He wanted to build a vehicle for his city. He spent years working on it. He built a carriage that looked like a standard horse-drawn buggy, but under the seat he placed his invention. He installed 24 battery cells. They were heavy. They weighed hundreds of pounds, but they worked. Morrison attached an electric motor to the rear axle. He connected the motor to the batteries with thick wires. The vehicle could carry 6 people. It had a top speed of 14 miles per hour. This does not sound fast today, but in 1890 it was exciting. It could travel for 50 miles before the batteries died. Morrison called it the electric automobile. Morrison showed his car at a parade in 1887. People lined the streets. They watched the strange machine roll by without a horse. The newspaper called it a wonder. Morrison was not done. He wanted to improve it. He moved to Chicago to find more investors. He rebuilt the car. He made it stronger. The big moment came in 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago. It was a fair to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus arriving in America. Millions of people came. They saw new inventions. They saw the Ferris wheel. They saw the light bulb. And they saw William Morrison's electric car. Morrison placed his vehicle in the transportation building. It sat among steam cars and gasoline cars. The visitors were amazed. The steam cars were loud and had fires inside them. The gas cars were dirty and hard to start. They often backfired. They scared people. But the electric car was different. It was silent. It was clean. A person could sit down and turn a switch. It moved instantly. There was no cranking a handle. There was no dangerous gasoline to pour. There was no hot steam to burn you. The judges at the fair gave Morrison a prize. They praised the engineering. The public loved it. This event was important. It showed the American public that the electric car was real. It was not just a toy for scientists. It was a machine for the future. Another key figure emerged in Rhode Island. His name was Philip W. Pratt. He built a small electric tricycle in 1888. It had one wheel in the front and two in the back. It looked like a bicycle with a motor. He used 6 batteries. The motor was mounted under the seat. It drove the front wheel. It worked well. Pratt drove it around the streets of Boston. It was the first electric vehicle built in New England. These early cars faced a big challenge. The challenge was the battery. Lead-acid batteries were heavy. They were the weak link. If you wanted to go far, you needed more batteries. If you added more batteries, the car got heavier. If the car got heavier, it needed more power to move. This was a circle that was hard to break. There was another challenge. There were no places to charge the car. Electricity was still new. Cities had power lines, but there were no charging stations. If a battery died, the car stopped. It could not move. You had to take the heavy batteries out and carry them inside to charge them. This was hard work. Despite these problems, the electric car had a golden period. It was a perfect fit for the city. In the city, people did not need to drive hundreds of miles. They needed to drive a few miles to work or to the store. They could charge the car at home overnight. This made sense. We must remember the roads in 1890. Outside the cities, there were almost no paved roads. They were dirt paths. They were muddy in the spring and dusty in the summer. Driving a car across the country was impossible, so the range of the car did not matter as much. Most driving was local. The electric car was perfect for local driving. The electric car also had a social appeal. It was a gentleman's car. It was a lady's car. It was safe. It was clean. A woman in a long dress could get in and out easily. There was no smell of oil on her clothes. The noise did not scare the children. The gasoline cars were dirty and rough. Only the brave drove them. The electric car offered class and comfort. As the 1890s progressed, more companies started to build electric cars. They were called electrics. The Morris and Salem Electrobat was built in Philadelphia in 1894. It looked like a box on wheels. It was designed for use as a taxi. The inventors, Henry Morris and Pedro Salem, saw a future where electric taxis would replace horse-drawn cabs. Their Electrobat had a steering tiller. It had big rubber tires. It was slow but steady. They built a fleet of them. In 1896, the Riker Electric Vehicle Company was formed in New York. The founder was Andrew Riker. He was a brilliant engineer. He loved electric cars. He built a small, fast car called the Riker Torpedo. It was a 2-seater. He raced it. It reached speeds of 40 miles per hour. This proved that electric cars could be fast. Electric Vehicle Company was formed in 1897. It bought the rights to the Morris and Salem design. They started a taxi service in New York City. This was the first time electric taxis hit the streets on a large scale. They were painted bright yellow so people could see them. The taxis were popular at first. The rich people of New York liked them. They were clean and quiet. But the experiment had problems. The batteries did not last long enough for a full day of work. The taxi drivers had to stop often to change batteries. It was expensive. The maintenance was high. The company failed after a few years. But it showed what was possible. It proved that electric cars could work in a real business. The history of this time is a story of choices. The world was choosing how it would move. Would it choose steam? Steam was powerful. Steam trains crossed the country. Steam cars existed. The Stanley steamer was a famous steam car. But steam cars took a long time to start. You had to light a fire and wait for the water to boil. You needed water and fuel. It was dangerous. Would the world choose gasoline? Gasoline was cheap. It had a lot of energy in a small can. But the engines were loud. They shook the whole car. They were hard to start. There was no key to turn. You had to crank the engine by hand. If the engine backfired, the crank could break your arm. Gasoline smelled bad. It was dangerous to store. It could catch fire. People were afraid of it. Many people thought gasoline cars were just a fad. They thought they were too dangerous for the public. The electric car seemed like the smart choice. It was the high-tech choice. The technology of electricity was advancing fast. Thomas Edison was a hero. People trusted electricity. It felt like the future. So, by the late 1890s, the electric car was a serious contender. It was not a failure. It was a success. It sold well in cities. It was popular with doctors. Doctors liked electric cars because they could start them instantly and rush to a patient. They did not have to stand outside and crank a car in the cold rain. In the year 1900, the United States stood at a crossroad. The nation was changing. The old world of horses was dying. The new world of machines was being born. If you walked down the street in a major city like New York or Chicago, you would see a strange mix of vehicles. You would see horse-drawn buggies. You would see loud, smelly gasoline cars. You would see steam cars puffing white vapor. But you would also see many silent, clean electric cars. It is a surprise to many people today, but in 1900, the electric car was not a loser. It was a winner. In fact, it was superior to the gasoline car in many ways. That year, American factories produced about 4,000 cars. Of these, 28% were electric. Only 22% were gasoline cars. The rest were steam cars. This was the peak of the electric car's popularity. It was the golden age. The silent machine was the king of the road. The people who bought electric cars were not ordinary citizens. They were the rich and the famous. They were the elite of society. A list of electric car owners from this time reads like a who's who of American history. John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in the world, drove an electric car. He enjoyed the smooth ride. He did not like the smell of gasoline. He did not want to get dirty. Thomas Edison, the great inventor, owned several electric cars. He believed in the technology. His friend Henry Ford owned an electric car for his wife, Clara. The most famous electric car of this time was the Baker Electric. The company was founded by Walter C. Baker in Cleveland, Ohio. Baker was a visionary. He started making electric cars in 1899. His cars were beautiful. They looked like fine carriages. They had polished wood bodies. They had brass lights. The seats were covered in plush velvet. To ride in a Baker Electric was to ride in luxury. Walter Baker was not just interested in comfort, he was interested in speed. He built a race car called the Baker Torpedo. It was a low-slung machine with 2 seats. It looked dangerous. In 1902, Baker took his car to a racetrack on Staten Island, New York. He wanted to set a speed record. He drove the car fast. It reached over 75 miles per hour. This was a huge speed for that time. But the car crashed. It hit a crowd of spectators. 2 people were killed. Walter Baker survived. He decided to stop building race cars. He focused his company on building safe, reliable luxury cars for the city. Another major player was the Detroit Electric Car Company. It was founded in 1907 by William C. Anderson. Anderson knew how to sell a dream. He did not sell a car, he sold a lifestyle. He advertised his cars as the most reliable machines on earth. He claimed they never broke down. He said they were perfect for women. The marketing for electric cars was very specific. It targeted women. At this time in history, society had different rules for women. Women did not usually crank heavy engines. They did not want to handle dirty gasoline. They did not want to get oil on their dresses. The electric car was the answer. It had a simple steering wheel or a tiller. It had a push-button controller. You pushed a button to go, you pulled a lever to stop. It was safe, it was clean, it was dignified. A famous advertisement from 1910 showed a woman driving a Detroit Electric. The text said, "She drives to her shopping and appointments with the ease and certainty of an expert." The car became a symbol of women's independence. It gave women freedom to move around the city without a man to help them. Suffragettes used electric cars for their campaigns. They decorated the cars with banners. They drove to rallies to fight for the right to vote. The technology of these cars was simple but effective. They used large lead-acid batteries. Some cars used an iron-nickel battery invented by Thomas Edison. This battery was called the Edison battery. It was lighter than a lead-acid battery. It lasted longer. It did not break as easily. But it was expensive. Many companies used it. The Detroit Electric used both types over the years. The batteries were heavy. They weighed hundreds of pounds. To balance the weight, the batteries were placed under the floor or under the seats. This gave the car a low center of gravity. It made the car stable. It did not tip over easily. The range of these cars was limited. A typical electric car in 1910 could travel about 50 to 80 miles on one charge. This was enough for city driving. You could drive to work, go to the store, and drive home. But you could not take a long trip into the country. There was a famous story about Thomas Alva Edison and Henry Ford. The two men were close friends. They took camping trips together. They called themselves the Vagabonds. They had a famous debate. Edison loved electricity. He thought the electric car was the future. Ford loved the internal combustion engine. He thought gasoline was the way to go. Ford once said, "Electricity must go a long way yet to compete with gasoline for general use." Edison was stubborn. He kept trying to improve the battery to prove Ford wrong. This friendly rivalry showed the conflict of the era. While electric cars ruled the city, the gasoline car was fighting for survival. Early gasoline cars were terrible machines. They were hard to start. They had a hand crank on the front. You had to insert the crank and turn it with all your might. If the engine backfired, the crank could spin backward. It could break your arm. It could break your thumb. People called it the broken arm business. The engines were loud. They vibrated the whole car. They produced a lot of smoke. City people hated them. Gasoline cars had one advantage. They could go anywhere. They had a long range. You could fill a tank with gasoline and drive for 200 miles. You could drive on dirt roads. You could drive between cities. As the American government started building better roads, people wanted to travel farther. The limitation of the electric battery became a problem. The 50-mile range was not enough for the growing American spirit. During this time, inventors tried to combine the best of both worlds. They tried to make a car that used electricity and gasoline. In 1911, a company called Woods Motor Vehicle Company released the Woods Dual Power. It was a hybrid car. It had a gasoline engine and an electric motor. It could run on electricity alone in the city at low speeds. Then, on the open road, the gasoline engine would turn on to help. It was a smart idea. It was too early. It was very expensive, and it did not sell well. But it was a sign of things to come. Another challenge was the infrastructure. Gasoline was easy to find. You could buy it at the drugstore. You could buy it at the hardware store. It was sold in cans. But electricity was harder to get for a car. There were no charging stations. If you had an electric car, you needed a charging station at your home. Only rich people had garages with electricity. Most regular people did not have electricity in their homes yet, so the electric car remained a toy for the rich. The electric taxi business also continued to grow. The New York taxi fleet was huge. It was operated by the Electric Vehicle Company. They had hundreds of electric taxis on the street. In 1907, the company had a problem. It was the Great Taxicab Scandal. The owners of the company were greedy. They overcharged the taxi drivers. They manipulated the stock market. The company went bankrupt. The taxis sat idle on the streets. They lost their paint. They rusted. The public saw the failure. It hurt the reputation of the electric car. People saw it as a business failure, not just a mechanical one. Despite these problems, electric car sales stayed strong until 1912. In 1912, about 12,000 electric cars were sold in the United States. It was the high point. Companies like Baker, Detroit Electric, and Waverly were making profits. They built big factories. They employed thousands of workers. The future looked bright. But a storm was coming. The storm had a name. It was not a person. It was an invention. It was the electric starter. In the winter of 1910, a man named Byron Carter was driving a gasoline car in Detroit. The car stopped. He got out to crank the engine. The engine backfired. The crank hit him in the jaw. He suffered a broken jaw and a broken arm. He died later from complications. He was a friend of Henry Leland, the head of Cadillac. Leland was sad. He was angry. He told his engineers that this had to stop. He refused to sell a car that killed people. He asked for a solution. He remembered that an electric motor did not need a crank. He asked, "Why can't we use an electric motor to start the gasoline engine?" An engineer named Charles Kettering found the answer. He worked for a company called Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, or Delco. He invented a small, powerful electric motor. This motor fit on the engine. When the driver turned a key, a small electric motor would spin the engine. It would start the car instantly. There was no cranking. There was no danger. In 1912, Cadillac introduced the electric starter. It was called the self-starter. It changed everything overnight. The biggest advantage of the electric car was gone. Now the gasoline car was just as easy to start. You did not need strength. You just turned a key. A woman could start a gasoline car just as easily as a man. The electric starter was a turning point in history. It removed the fear of the gasoline car. Now people could have the long range of the gasoline car without the hard work of starting it. The sales of electric cars began to drop. Henry Ford was also changing the industry. He introduced the Model T in 1908. At first, it was just another car, but Ford had a new way to build it. He used the assembly line. This made cars fast. It made cars cheap. In 1908, a Model T cost $850. That was a lot of money. But by 1925, a Model T cost less than $300. An electric car still cost $3,000. The average person could afford a Ford. They could not afford an electric car. The electric car companies could not compete on price. Their batteries were made by hand. They used expensive materials. They could not use an assembly line easily. The cars were heavy. They were slow. The range was short. The world was moving fast. The roads were getting longer. Americans wanted to travel. They wanted to see the country. The electric car was stuck in the city. The history of this time is a story of a shift in values. In 1900, people valued clean and quiet. By 1915, people valued cheap and fast. The electric car was a luxury item. The gasoline car became a tool for the masses. In 1914, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison joined forces. They wanted to build a cheap electric car. They wanted to use Edison's new battery. Ford spent over $1 million on the project. They built prototypes, they tested them, but the project failed. The battery was not ready. It was too heavy. It was too expensive. Ford canceled the project in 1914. He decided to focus all his efforts on the Model T. This was the moment the electric car lost its strongest potential ally. If Ford had built a cheap electric car, history might be different. The 1920s arrived in the United States with a roar. It was a time of great change. The First World War was over. The economy was growing. Cities were expanding upward with skyscrapers. They were expanding outward with suburbs. The mood of the country shifted. The quiet dignity of the past was replaced by a desire for speed, noise, and excitement. For the electric car, this decade was a slow, painful march toward the edge of a cliff. The machine that once ruled the streets was now becoming a relic. It was pushed aside by the industrial might of the gasoline engine. The silence that was once a virtue was now seen as a weakness. The electric car was trapped in a changing world that no longer wanted what it offered. The biggest challenge for the electric car was the road itself. In the previous chapter, we spoke of bad dirt roads, but in the 1920s, the U.S. government decided to build a new system of highways. The Federal Aid Road Act of 1921 provided money to states to build paved roads. A massive network of highways began to stretch across the nation. Route 66 was established in 1926. It connected Chicago to Los Angeles. Americans fell in love with the road trip. They wanted to see the country. They wanted to drive from coast to coast. This new freedom required a car that could go long distances. It required a car that could be refueled quickly. The electric car could not do this. It was a prisoner of the city. It could not leave the comfortable radius of its charging station. While the gasoline car roamed freely on the open highway, the electric car sat parked in the garage. The price of gasoline also played a cruel trick on the electric car. In the early 1900s, gasoline was expensive, but as more oil wells were drilled, especially in Texas, the price dropped. It became very cheap. By the mid-1920s, gasoline was affordable for almost everyone. You could fill your tank for pennies. In contrast, electricity was still expensive. Generating electricity was costly. For a regular working family, the math was simple. A gas car was cheap to buy and cheap to run. An electric car was expensive to buy and expensive to run. Henry Ford continued his revolution. His assembly line moved faster and faster. He produced millions of Model T cars. He paid his workers a high wage so they could afford to buy his cars. The middle class was born. The middle class did not want a luxury electric carriage. They wanted a cheap, rugged car that could take them anywhere. Ford's dream of a car for the masses had come true. The electric car remained a car for the few. The companies that made electric cars tried to fight back. They could not compete on price or range. So they doubled down on luxury and quality. The Detroit Electric Car Company refused to lower its standards. Their cars were still built with the best materials. They used the finest wood and leather. They advertised that their cars would last a lifetime. In 1920, Detroit Electric released a new model. It claimed a range of 100 miles. This was a technical improvement, but it was not enough. The car still cost nearly $3,000. A Ford Model T cost less than $300. The gap was too wide. Only the very wealthy, like the Rockefeller family or the Firestone family, still bought electrics. They often bought them as second cars for the wives to use in the city, while the husband drove a gasoline car for travel. This created a strange social division. The electric car became a symbol of ladies' transport. It was seen as delicate. It was seen as not powerful enough for a man. As women gained more rights and society changed, this marketing actually hurt the car. Women did not want to be told they were too weak to drive a real car. They wanted the freedom of the open road too. The gasoline car became the symbol of freedom for everyone, men and women alike. There is a lesser-known chapter of electric vehicle history that survived in the shadows. While the passenger electric car was dying, the electric delivery truck was thriving. In large cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, companies used fleets of electric trucks for delivery. Why? Because they were perfect for short trips. They stopped and started all day. An electric motor is great for this. It does not use fuel while idling. A gasoline engine wastes fuel and creates fumes while stopped. Walker Electric Vehicle Company and General Electric Company built thousands of electric trucks. They delivered milk, bread, and laundry. They were quiet in the morning streets. They did not wake the neighbors. They were reliable. They lasted longer than the gasoline trucks of the time, which broke down often under heavy use. These workhorses kept the electric dream alive in a practical way, even if the public forgot about them. Another factor in the decline was the tire industry. In the early 1900s, roads were bad. Cars needed big, sturdy tires to survive the potholes. But as roads got paved, cars could go faster. They needed tires that could handle high speeds. The tire companies focused their research on tires for fast gasoline cars. Electric cars were slow. They used heavy, hard tires. These tires gave a rough ride. The technology of tires passed the electric car by. It made the ride quality worse compared to the smooth-riding pneumatic tires on gas cars. The technology of the battery had also hit a wall. Inventors had tried everything. They tried nickel-iron batteries. They tried zinc-air batteries. They tried improving lead-acid batteries. But they faced the laws of physics. Batteries store energy chemically. To store a lot of energy, you need heavy materials. To make it light, you give up energy storage. This problem could not be solved with the science of the 1920s. The internal combustion engine was getting better every year. It got more powerful. It got more efficient. The electric motor stayed mostly the same. By the late 1920s, the market for electric passenger cars had collapsed. Many companies went bankrupt. The Baker Electric Company, which once raced cars, stopped making passenger vehicles. They merged with another company to make industrial parts. The Waverly Electric Company closed its doors. The golden age was a distant memory. Then came 1929. The stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. This was the final blow. The luxury market disappeared overnight. No one had money to buy a $3,000 car. People struggled to buy food. The few remaining electric car companies had no customers. Detroit Electric managed to survive by selling a handful of cars to their loyal, wealthy clients. But the volume was tiny. In 1929, they sold about 1,000 cars. By 1935, they sold less than 50. The cultural shift was complete. The electric car became a joke. In cartoons and comic strips, the electric car was drawn as slow and bulky. It was driven by old ladies who could not see over the steering wheel. It was an object of pity. The world had fallen in love with the noise of the engine. The sound of a V8 motor became the sound of progress. It became the sound of America. During the Depression, the government also stepped in to help the gasoline industry. The New Deal programs built even more roads. The Public Works Administration spent millions on infrastructure. This made it easier than ever to drive a gas car across the country. Gas stations were everywhere. They became familiar landmarks. You could drive from New York to California and find gas every few miles. But if you drove an electric car, you were stranded as soon as you left the city limits. The story of the electric truck also began to fade in the 1930s. Gasoline engines became more reliable. They stopped breaking down as often. The price of gas stayed low. Companies started to switch their fleets to gasoline trucks because they could go faster and carry heavier loads. By the late 1930s, the electric truck was also becoming rare. One specific incident highlights the decline. In 1934, a writer for a popular magazine decided to drive an electric car to see if it was still useful. He borrowed a Detroit Electric. He drove it through the city. He wrote that it was a magnificent machine for the city. It was smooth and quiet, but then he wrote about its sadness. He said it felt like a ghost from the past. He noted that people on the streets stared at it. Children laughed at it. It did not belong in the modern world of 1934. The article was a kind obituary for the electric passenger car. The last major electric car company in America was Detroit Electric. They struggled on through the 1930s. They tried to update their styling. They made the cars look a bit more like modern gas cars. They removed the old-fashioned carriage lamps. They put on fenders. But underneath, it was the same old technology. The price was still too high. In 1939, the company ceased production of cars. They shifted to making parts for the war effort. The era of the electric car in America was effectively over. It is important to understand why this happened. It was not because the electric car was a bad machine. It was a victim of progress. The world chose a different path. The path of oil was cheap and abundant. The path of mass production made complex machines affordable. The electric car was simple and elegant, but it could not compete with the economics of the oil age. The consequences of this choice were huge. The air in cities began to get dirty. Smog became a problem in Los Angeles and other cities. The noise level rose dramatically. The world became dependent on oil. This led to wars and political conflicts later in the century. But in the 1930s, no one thought about that. They just enjoyed the freedom of the open road. As the world moved toward World War II, the electric car seemed to be gone forever. It was left behind in the dust of the assembly line. The factories that once built them were converted to build tanks and jeeps. The jeeps were all powered by gasoline. The silent spark had been extinguished by the roar of the 20th century. But history works in cycles. Sometimes the solution to a problem is found by looking back. The challenges of the 1930s, range, cost, speed, killed the electric car. But deep inside the minds of a few inventors, the idea never truly died. It waited in the dark. It waited for the world to change again. It waited for the oil to become scarce again. It waited for the cities to become too noisy again.